You are no longer good for anything. Those words still echo in my mind as if they were spoken just now, whispered venomously in front of everyone. They didn't come from a stranger. They didn't come from someone distant. They came from the mouth of my own daughter-in-law, the woman my son chose to share his life with. And I, who gave my best for years, who built every piece of the house where they now live, listened silently to that sentence as if it were a broken object, ready to be thrown away. My name is Manuel. I'm 75 years old. I don't run like I used to. My hands no longer grip the hoe as firmly as they once did, but my heart still beats with stories and memories. And I never imagined that one day I would be treated like a burden. That Sunday, everyone was gathered in the backyard for my oldest grandson's birthday. The children were running around, the table was set, and I, sitting in a chair in the corner, joyfully observed the little I still had left. The presence of my family. That's when it all happened. I tried to help in the kitchen, offering my hands to carry the heavy dishes. My daughter-in-law, Clara, looked at me with contempt and said loudly, so everyone could hear, "You are no longer of any use." The silence that followed was suffocating. No one defended me, not even my son. I saw some lower their eyes, others pretend not to hear. And in that moment, I felt as if a lifetime of sacrifice had been erased by a cruel sentence. But I didn't end my story there, because if Clara thought I would keep quiet, she was wrong. A strength I didn't even know I still possessed was born within me. And that very day, in front of everyone, I decided to face it. I wasn't born old or useless, as Clara wanted to portray me to everyone. There was a time when my hands built walls, dug ditches, harvested the earth, and supported an entire family. I still remember the days when I would leave the house before sunrise, my face still wet with dew, and only return when the moon was high. Elena, my wife, was waiting for me with the table set, and the little boys would run to my lap as if I were their hero. That's how we built everything we have. Brick by brick, sweat by sweat. The house where my son and Clara now live was built by my own hands. I didn't just build walls, I built dreams. I gave them a future. I sacrificed my rest so they could study, grow, and live better than I did. But it seems time has a bitter way of turning the page. When Elena left, the house grew quieter. Her voice, which always balanced the harshness of life, was no longer there to defend me. My children grew up, got married, and I gradually became a tolerated visitor within the space I helped create. The worst part is that I didn't realize it right away. I believed I still belonged, that I was still needed. I mowed the lawn, mended the fence, tended the garden. But as the years passed, they began to pull me away from these small tasks. First, with kind words. "Let me do it, Mr. Manuel. You've already worked enough." Then with curt orders. "You don't need to touch that, don't get in the way." Until finally the sentence that cut deeper than any blade. "You're no longer good for anything." And that's when the real pain began. Not just hearing those words, but realizing that my own son, sitting at the table, said nothing in my defense. My son's silence at that moment was worse than my daughter-in-law's words, because I'd already expected a certain coldness from her. We'd never been close, and I always felt she saw me as a hindrance. But from him I expected loyalty, gratitude, a modicum of respect. After all, I raised him, fed him, educated him, sacrificed nights and days so he could have a future. I remembered right there, sitting, a distant incident. He was still a boy when he fell from a tree and broke his arm. I ran in desperation, carried him to the hospital and stayed by his side, unable to sleep, holding his hand so he wouldn't be afraid. I promised him that night that I would always be there to protect him. And now, decades later, he didn't have the courage to raise his voice to protect me from humiliation. When the party ended, I returned home carrying more than the weight of years. Inside me, something was broken. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard her voice repeating, "You're no longer good for anything." And I saw my son's face, motionless, silent, as if in agreement. I walked through the empty house, touched the walls I'd built with Elena, and wondered if it had all been in vain. If the sacrifices of a lifetime could be erased by a generation that knows neither hunger nor the hardness of a hoe. It was there, in the silence of the early morning, that I realized That wound wasn't just Clara's mouth. It was a wound opened by the indifference of my own blood. In the days that followed, it seemed like every object in my house repeated that cruel phrase. The chair where I used to sit to read the newspaper was no longer a place of rest, but a reminder that I was seen as useless. The clock hanging on the wall ticked slowly as if mocking me. "You're old. Time has beaten you." Even the garden, which I loved so much, seemed to wither along with my spirit. I started avoiding visits to my son's house. Before, I always made excuses to show up. I'd bring fruit, help fix something, look for any reason to feel part of their lives. Now, every step in that direction seemed to lead to greater humiliation. And when I did see Clara, the way she looked at me was enough to make me realize I wasn't welcome. But what hurt me most wasn't her rejection, but his silence. My son, that boy who once looked at me with admiration when I rode his first bike. The same boy who promised me at 18 that he would never leave me alone. Where was that look now? Where were those promises? In solitude, I began revisiting memories with Elena. Her laughter echoed off the walls, reminding me that there was a time when I was loved and respected. I felt such a loss that it felt like my chest would burst open. It was in this emptiness that I realized the pain wasn't just in being told I was no longer useful. It was in believing it could be true. And that's when the resentment began to morph into something else. A small but vivid flame that said, "You won't be silenced. You still have a voice. You're still Manuel." Around this time, my nights became long and restless. I would go to bed early, but sleep would not come. I would stare at the ceiling, listening to the creaking of the house's ancient wood, as if even it was complaining of loneliness. Sometimes I would get up and walk to the kitchen, pour a glass of water. But the thirst I felt wasn't for liquid. It was for respect, for dignity. I remembered when Elena was still with me. She had a firm but sweet way of reminding me who I was. If she had heard that phrase, she certainly would have defended me immediately, without fear, without hesitation. But she was no longer here, and it was precisely this absence that allowed them to treat me this way, as if I were just a remnant of a life already spent. I began to talk to myself with my memories. I spoke in a low voice, as if she could hear. "Elena, am I really no longer good for anything?" And the silence of the house was the only answer. My daughter-in-law's words resonated so much that I began to believe the whole world thought so. At the grocery store, when the cashier asked me to wait a moment, it felt like confirmation. When a neighbor didn't respond to my good morning, I interpreted it as a sign that I was invisible. It was at that point that I understood the extent of the wound. It wasn't just the cruelty of a sentence, but the way it had embedded itself in my heart, trying to convince me that I had truly lost my worth. And deep down I knew, if I didn't react, if I didn't find a way to show who I was, that sentence would kill me silently. The following Sunday, I woke up early and looked in the mirror. The image reflected was that of an aging man. Yes, with deep wrinkles and tired eyes. But behind that face was still the same Manuel who once built walls, supported a family, and was called a role model by many. And it was at that moment that I realized I could not allow Clara's voice to be stronger than my own story. I spent the day reminiscing about moments in my life. The calloused hands that held heavy tools, the late nights caring for a sick child, the birthdays where I worked late but came home with a simple gift just to see a smile. Each memory was proof that I still served. Not as they wanted, but as a man, as a father, as a grandfather. What Clara said in front of everyone had been a low blow, but it also served as a wake-up call. If before I had silently accepted exclusion, now I felt something different burning inside me, a mixture of pain and courage. I wouldn't let that be the last word on who I was. That same day, sitting on the porch with the sun setting behind the mountains, I decided I would face her. Not out of empty pride, but so that everyone present would know that Manuel still had a voice, still had value, and that no one, not even an ungrateful daughter-in-law, had the right to erase a lifetime of sacrifice and love. After that silent Sunday when I made my decision, I began to observe more closely everything that was happening within the family. I knew I couldn't just go before everyone with anger. I needed to be prepared with every word ready, every memory fresh. This wouldn't be an outburst. It would be a reckoning with the truth. I began jotting down little things in an old brown notebook. In it, I wrote everything from recent events to old memories that revealed who I had always been. Each line was like a weapon against the lie they tried to cast upon me. I'm no longer good for anything. I read and reread this sentence, and right below it I wrote, I built the house they live in. I paid for their son's education. I raised their grandchildren when they needed it. I also revisited some old neighbors, people who had known me since my youth. We talked about the old days, and with each encounter I confirmed something important. My life was neither invisible nor useless. I was still remembered with respect by those who knew where I came from. That gave me strength. On days when sadness overwhelmed me, I would walk to the cemetery where Elena lay. I would sit beside the headstone and talk as if she were still there, listening. I would tell her everything. Clara's words, our son's silence, the weight it caused me. And when I left, it was as if I took with me a spark of courage, as if she were silently saying to me, "Go, Manuel, don't let them silence you." It was thus, little by little, that I began to prepare not only my words, but also my heart. I knew the confrontation was coming, and that I could not hide when the time came. With the brown notebook always by my side, I began revisiting every detail of my own journey. I didn't want to just recount vague memories. I wanted to recall facts no one could dispute. I jotted down dates, sacrifices, and achievements. I wrote about the night I sold my motorcycle to pay for my son's college tuition. I documented how, when Clara had her first baby, I spent weeks taking care of the house, cooking and doing laundry so she could rest. Each memory was living proof against that cruel sentence. You're no longer good for anything. I also began to observe their behavior silently. Clara became increasingly impatient when I appeared. I'd only have to offer to help with a task for her to retort sarcastically. My son, on the other hand, seemed trapped in his own silence. Perhaps out of fear of confrontation, perhaps out of comfort, but he never dared contradict her. And I, silent, filled my notebook with notes and feelings. One day, talking to my old friend Joaquim, who had known my story since I was young, I told him part of what was happening. He looked me in the eye and said, "Manuel, the worst act of cowardice is to allow someone to lie about you without defending yourself. If you don't speak up now, they'll bury your dignity while you're still alive." Those words struck me deeply. He was right. I couldn't carry on a lifetime of struggle and love only to be remembered in the end as a useless old man. So I set a goal. I would wait for the next family gathering. When everyone was present, I would speak. Not with hatred, but with firmness. I would show everyone who I was, who I still am. And if my voice trembled, let it tremble with emotion, never with fear. The following days were spent in silent preparation. Each morning before sunrise, I sat on the porch with my notebook open, rereading each entry. Tears fell as I recalled moments that seemed so distant, but these tears were no longer tears of weakness. They were fuel. I also jotted down phrases I wanted to say at the right moment. They wouldn't be insults. They wouldn't be shouts. They would be truths no one could deny. I wrote, "I was the one who supported this family when there was no bread on the table." And further down, "If today you walk with your heads held high, it's because someone before you carried the weight of shame and need." I started practicing in the mirror. It seems silly for a man my age, but I wanted my words to come out firmly, without hesitation. I held the notebook in my hand, stared at my own reflection, and said each sentence aloud. Sometimes I felt my voice falter, and then I repeated it until I felt it coming from within, from my soul, and not just from my mouth. I also prepared myself for the worst. I knew Clara might laugh, mock, try to silence me with more contempt, and perhaps my son would remain cowardly silent. But it didn't matter. In that moment, I no longer sought applause or recognition. What I wanted was to leave it engraved in front of everyone that Manuel was not a burden. Manuel was history. He was work. He was blood spilled in sweat. As the date of the next family reunion approached, I felt a mix of anxiety and strength. I knew it would be painful, but I was ready. It wouldn't just be a rant, it would be a milestone. After that day, no one could say I'd kept quiet. In the week leading up to the meeting, I took care of every detail. I sorted through old documents, photographs stored in shoeboxes, letters from Elena, everything that could show not just words, but evidence of the life I'd built. I put everything in a blue folder, which I always kept close to me. I didn't intend to turn it into a tribunal, but if anyone dared to call me useless again, I would hold in my hands the undeniable truth. I also began to observe my grandchildren. They still looked at me fondly, still ran to hug me when I appeared, and this gave me hope. Perhaps the generation that followed wouldn't inherit the contempt. Perhaps in their hearts, there was still room to remember who I truly am. I thought about them a lot, and a phrase stuck in my notebook. Even if parents forget, children will remember. Sometimes, alone at night, doubt would try to overcome me. What if no one hears me? What if they laugh at me? What if my voice breaks in front of everyone? I would close my eyes and see Elena's face. It was as if she were saying to me, "It's not for them that you speak, Manuel. It's for yourself. It's for your dignity." These memories kept me going. I also told Joaquim about my decision. He smiled, put his hand on my shoulder, and replied, "Then the time has come, my friend. The time has come to show that Manuel is still alive." At that moment, I felt there was no turning back. The day of the confrontation was etched in my heart. When the meeting date was finally set, something inside me calmed. There was no more room for indecision. I knew that this would be the day I would stand up not only to Clara's cruelty, but also to the silence that had been slowly killing me. On the morning of the meeting, I wore my best, carefully pressed shirt. It wasn't vanity. It was self-respect. I put Elena's antique watch in the inside pocket of my coat, the one she said marked not only time, but also family history. In the blue folder, I kept the brown notebook, the photographs, the letters, and the documents. It was like carrying a piece of my life with me, ready to be displayed to anyone who wanted to erase it. Before leaving, I sat on the porch and remained silent for a few minutes. The wind carried the scent of flowers from the garden, and for a moment, I felt as if Elena were there with me. I closed my eyes and imagined her voice. "Go, Manuel. Show who you are. This isn't the end. It's just the moment to lift your head." I calmly stood up, grabbed my briefcase, and closed the door. With every step toward my son's house, the floor seemed to echo. "You still serve. You still serve. You still serve." And so I arrived at the gate, ready to face in front of everyone the woman who tried to reduce me to nothing. The gate creaked as I pushed gently. The yard was already full. Mingled voices, the smell of roasting meat, laughter that didn't include me. I walked slowly, feeling the eyes turn to me. Some smiled slightly, others just looked away. My son stood near the grill, pretending to be more occupied than necessary, as if unsure where I fit in. And Clara, as always, was in the center of the circle, giving orders, distributing smiles that hid the iron edge behind her tongue. I greeted everyone one by one and sat in silence, my blue folder beside me. The minutes dragged by, but I wasn't in a rush. I knew the opportunity would come. And it did. Clara, bothered by my silence and the folder I carried like a treasure, made a point of teasing me. "Are you still carrying around junk? You should rest. Enjoy your age. It's no longer useful." The sentence dropped like a stone in the middle of the conversation, exactly as I expected. Some laughed nervously, others lowered their eyes. My son froze. I took a deep breath, stood up, and in a firm voice replied, "Clara, today you will not silence my story." The circle closed in silence. Everyone looked at me, some curious, others embarrassed. I picked up the blue folder, opened it slowly, and placed the brown notebook, the old photos, and Elena's watch on the table. The air seemed to grow heavier. "You say I'm useless. Well, look right here." I pointed to the photos. "I was the one who built every wall of this house, who supported this floor where your children play. When there was no bread, it was from my calloused hands that sustenance came. When Clara needed care, I was the one who provided it. I served, yes. I served with my entire life." The silence turned to tension. I knew this was just the beginning. No one moved. The smell of meat on the grill no longer mattered. The noise of the children in the background seemed distant. Everyone was riveted to my words. Clara, with a forced smile, crossed her arms and tried to answer. "No one is saying you didn't do anything in the past, Manuel. But now you can't help anymore. You're just getting in the way." My blood boiled, but I didn't lose control. I picked up the brown notebook, opened it to one of the pages, and read aloud. April 12th, 1998. I sold my motorcycle to pay my son's college tuition. July 4th, 2005. I spent 3 weeks taking care of the house while Clara recovered from childbirth. September 20th, 2010. I used my savings to pay off the debt that threatened to take the family car. I closed the notebook slowly, looked at everyone and said, "No, Clara, it's not that I'm in the way. It's just that you forgot to look back. You forgot that the foundation of everything you have was built with the sweat of someone you now dare to despise." My son seemed smaller before me. His eyes shone, but his mouth remained closed. His aunts and cousins murmured, exchanging glances. I knew I was poking at wounds everyone preferred to hide, but there was no turning back. I took Elena's watch and held it up for everyone to see. This clock has marked every dawn I've woken to work, every tear I've wiped away, every dream I've helped realize. And as long as it keeps track of time, my life will have value. I will not accept being treated like a burden. The weight of my words fell upon everyone, and for the first time Clara had no ready answer. The silence that followed seemed louder than any argument. I could see their glances exchanged, some trying to hide it, others clearly embarrassed. Clara, nervous, laughed awkwardly and murmured, "You're exaggerating. No one here meant to offend." I lightly slammed my hand down on the table, not violently but firmly. What they did to me is an exaggeration. It's an exaggeration to erase years of struggle with a cruel sentence. It's an exaggeration to look at a man who gave his all and treat him like disposable trash. I pulled out one of the photos I'd brought. It was from when my son was still in his school uniform, smiling next to a bicycle. I held it up for everyone to see. This bike didn't fall from the sky. It was paid for with overtime and sleepless nights. And you dare say I'm useless? My son's face was pale. I could see in his eyes the battle between shame and cowardice. Clara tried to maintain her composure, but her rapid breathing betrayed her. The others, silent, no longer had the courage to look me in the eye. I took a deep breath and continued, "I don't ask for applause, I don't ask for crowns, I don't ask for thrones. I only ask for respect. Respect for my story, for Elena's memory, for the sweat that built this table where you now eat." Suddenly, one of the children, my youngest grandson, ran up to me and grabbed my hand. He looked at me innocently and said, "Grandpa, you're good for me." That sentence was like a bolt of lightning. The tears I'd been holding back until then threatened to escape, and I realized I'd already won. My grandson's voice echoed like a hammer in an iron silence. "Grandpa, you're good for me." Everyone listened. Some smiled awkwardly, others lowered their heads. Clara tried to force a laugh, but her mask was already cracked. I bent down, hugged the boy, and replied, "Thank you, son. That's all I needed to hear." Then I stood up and faced the adults again. "You judge me for what you think I can no longer do. But this boy sees something you've forgotten. I'm not just my spent strength, I'm a memory, an example, a foundation, and no one can take that away." Clara finally exploded. "You're being dramatic. You always think you're the center of everything. Life has changed, Manuel. You should accept your place." I stared at her hard. "And what is my place, Clara? To be humiliated in silence? To be treated as a nuisance? No. My place is to hold my head high and remind everyone here that if you walk confidently today, it's because someone before you paved the way with sweat and tears." People around me began to murmur, some in support, others simply in surprise. I knew I was touching familiar wounds, but I didn't care. My voice no longer trembled. I picked up the brown notebook, tapped it lightly, and said, "This book is not made of paper and ink. It is made of memories that no one will erase. And I will never accept being reduced to nothing while I still have the breath to speak." Clara tried to respond, but her voice faltered. The weight of my words had fallen upon her. My son finally stood up. His face was flushed, his eyes watery. For the first time in a long time, he looked at me not as an ashamed man, but as the boy who once trusted me to protect him from everything. His voice trembled. "Father, forgive me. I should have spoken sooner. I should have defended you." The tears I'd held back for so long streamed down my face. I shook my head, taking a deep breath. "It's not defense I need, my son. It's respect. It's remembrance. I'm not a burden. I'm part of this story." Clara lowered her eyes. Her silence was a confession. There was no reply, no justification. The relatives around her said nothing either. I had spoken, and my words were etched in everyone's hearts. I took Elena's watch and placed it on the table. The ticking seemed to echo in the air. As long as this clock keeps time, my life will have value. And let everyone here remember that. Then I closed the folder, held my grandson's hand, and sat back down. There was nothing left to prove. The confrontation had been made, and my voice, which they had tried to silence, now echoed louder than ever. In that moment, I felt a part of my lost dignity return to me. But I didn't yet know that a much greater turnaround was about to happen, not in front of my family, but within my own heart. That night after the confrontation, I returned home with the blue folder under my arm and my heart pounding. I had said what I needed to. I had defended my dignity. I had shown everyone that Manuel was still alive. But when I closed the door and was alone, I realized something still weighed heavy inside me. Yes, they had heard my words. Clara lowered her eyes. My son cried. The relatives fell silent. But what about me? The emptiness was still there. It was as if I had won the battle but remained defeated inside. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling for hours. Her words still echoed, not because I believed them, but because they had left their mark. The anger, the hurt, the resentment, all of it still held me captive. And I realized that even after facing them all, I still wasn't free. It was then that I remembered the words of my wife, Elena. She always said, "Manuel, life is not won with shouting or force, only with love." At that memory, I felt a pang in my chest. I had defended my worth, but I hadn't loved. And for the first time in years, I knelt beside my bed and spoke to God. I didn't use pretty words. I just cried and said, "Lord, I can't carry this alone anymore. Take this pain away from me. Give me peace." There, kneeling on the cold floor, the tears flowed uncontrollably. For years, I had maintained pride, silence, and strength. But now there was no mask, no defense. It was just me, the pain, and a sincere plea. As I cried, something different happened. I didn't hear voices. I didn't see strange lights. But I felt a real, living presence that filled the entire room. It was as if someone had placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "I never left you, Manuel. I was always here." It was at that moment that I realized I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. My entire life, with its victories and failures, was already in God's hands. And the gentle voice of the Holy Spirit began to whisper within me, reminding me that I was not a burden, not useless, but a beloved child. The pain gave way to a peace I had never felt before. The grief that consumed me began to dissolve, like ice melting in the sun. For the first time since Elena's death, I didn't feel alone. I understood that my worth wasn't in what my children said, nor in Clara's words, but in what Jesus had already done for me. I arose from that ground different. I no longer needed to plot revenge or carry a grudge. The Holy Spirit had given me a greater strength, the power to forgive. The next morning I woke early, but something was different. The weight I'd carried for months was no longer on my shoulders. I walked to the porch, took a deep breath, and quietly thanked God. "Thank you, Jesus, because now I know I'm not alone." As the sun rose, I realized that true victory wasn't in humiliating Clara or drawing tears from my son. Victory was in forgiving, not because they deserved it, but because I too had been forgiven. I picked up the brown notebook once more. Beneath the notes of sacrifice and pain, I wrote a new sentence. Today I decided to forgive, because Jesus forgave me first. And as I wrote, I felt as if each wound was stitched together with invisible threads of peace. Days later, I returned to my son's house. I entered without fear, without rancor. Clara was in the kitchen, surprised by my arrival. My son came to me hesitantly, as if expecting more accusations. But instead, I opened my arms and hugged them. They froze, but I said, "I hold nothing against you. What happened is forgiven. I found the one who gave me a new life, and I want you to find it too." My eyes filled with tears. For the first time, they weren't tears of pain, but of liberation. The impact was immediate. My son, who until then had only been able to lower his eyes, burst into tears and hugged me tightly, just like when he was a boy. He repeated over and over, "Father, forgive me. Forgive me." Clara stood still for a moment. Her eyes were teary, but her pride still held her together. I said nothing, just held out my hand. It was enough to make her start crying too. "I was wrong," he said, his voice breaking. "I said horrible things. I can't believe you still forgive us." I held her hand and replied, "I couldn't do it alone. But Jesus taught me that forgiveness isn't weakness, it's freedom, and I choose to be free." In that yard, the very place where I had been humiliated, there were now tears of reconciliation. My grandchildren, confused, came running and surrounded us, and I said to them, "Never let hatred take over your heart. Forgiveness is stronger than any offense." At that moment, I realized that God had transformed the greatest pain of my life into a living testimony before my own family. The Holy Spirit had done what my own strength could never have done: restore. The sun was already setting when we all sat down at the table. There were no full plates, no feast prepared. There was something greater: reconciliation. For the first time in many years, I felt like the house was home again. The silence was no longer one of contempt, but of peace. I looked at my son and said, "I return here neither as a victim nor as a hero. I return as a man who found in Jesus the strength to forgive. Because if he forgave me everything, who am I not to forgive you?" The words weren't rehearsed. They came out lightly, naturally, as if they weren't my own. My grandchildren smiled. Clara wiped her face, and my son seemed to carry less weight on his shoulders. In that moment, I understood. The real confrontation wasn't with Clara, nor with the cruel words she'd hurled at me. The real confrontation was with my own hardened heart. And there, that afternoon, Jesus triumphed in me. I ended the conversation with a promise. I want everyone to know, no matter what happened, this family belongs to God. And as long as I live, I will remind each of you that forgiveness is the greatest legacy I can leave. And so, in the same backyard where I was humiliated, our family's new story was born. Not written with resentment, but sealed by grace. If you've made it this far, you may have felt something similar to what I experienced. Maybe you've been betrayed, humiliated, forgotten, maybe even by the people you loved most. I know how it hurts. I know what it's like to feel worthless. But I also discovered something that changed everything: forgiveness in Jesus Christ. It wasn't easy. I fought against my own pride, against the urge to scream, to seek revenge, to show everyone the injustice I'd suffered. But I realized I could never win this fight alone. It was when I bent my knees and surrendered my heart to God that the darkness began to dissipate. The Holy Spirit showed me that forgiveness isn't about forgetting the pain, but about choosing not to let it define me. And I want to tell you this today. You too can forgive. You too can be free. It doesn't matter how big the wound is or how long it's been open. When Jesus enters a story, he doesn't just write a new chapter, he rewrites the entire book. I, an old man who was told by his own daughter-in-law that I was good for nothing, discovered that I do serve. I serve an eternal purpose. I serve as a living testimony to God's power. And if he did it for me, he can do it for you too. So, no longer carry hatred, no longer carry resentment. Forgive, love. Surrender your pain to Christ and allow him to transform the end of your story into a new beginning. If this message touched your heart, I invite you to continue this journey with me. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this story. Maybe someone close to you needs to hear that there is still hope, that there is still forgiveness. And I leave a question in the air. What would you do if you discovered that forgiveness was the missing key to freeing your own life? Until the next video, may God bless you and your family.